So it's my pleasure to introduce Daniela Wenger. She graduated from UC Berkeley in 2018. I have to be reminded of that. After a summer internship with Spotify, Daniela spent the following year as a Fulbright scholar in Israel, teaching at Bezalel Academy of Arts and Design and conducting a research project under the auspices of Hebrew University. She then pursued and completed an MPhil in public policy at Cambridge University. Daniela's talk today draws from her research project as a Fulbright scholar and as a graduate student at Cambridge. She currently works for the Center for the Future of Democracy at Cambridge University, where her research focuses on democracy evaluation and qualifying and quantifying satisfaction with democracy and its relationship to freedom of speech and populism in numerous countries. Danielle is also an alumna of our Institute's Undergraduate Fellows Program, and she was part of it for all 4 years and had a more senior leadership role in her senior year. So I also wanted to emphasize that. And please welcome Daniela to talk, to give her talk on Let the Creators Sing, Informing Democracy Indices with Israeli Creators' Voices. So welcome.
Hey, thank you so much, Rebecca. I really appreciate that. It's such an honor to be here and be among such a lively group of people. And I just wanted to thank you and Professor Hafner and Maya for your not just support in this specific talk, but also support over really the past 5-6 years. That's really been incredible. So we have a lot, and I also want to thank my Cambridge friends. Thank you so much for being here. It means so much to me to have your support from really all over the world in so many different time zones. And thank you for my family and family friends. I see you here as well, so thank you. And with that, we have a lot to go through today. I'm planning on speaking for about, 30 to 40 minutes, and then I hope that you can come and we can discuss and argue and wrestle with one another with the rest of our time here together today. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen. And we're going to get started. So I'm just going to start out with a bit of an agenda today. So first, I'm going to introduce myself and the literature related to issues of freedom of speech and creators and democracy. Then I'm going to discuss the scope of the variety of issues at hand, and then ultimately arrive at my research question and actually present my findings to you up front, and then tell you and take a step back a little bit and explain to you how I arrived at those findings. I'm going to then present my methods. We're going to talk about 3 different methods today. The first is qualitative ethnographies and interviews. The second is a survey that I fielded during the summer of 2020. And the third method that we're going to talk about is using big data, so large public opinion polls related to satisfaction with democracy. Then I'm going to present the data itself, review some findings, and then present some findings and limitations, and then also present some areas for future research and areas that I may want to get at in the future. So a little bit of an introduction. And before I start with this introduction, I just want to hold a little bit of a disclaimer here that what I'm going to be presenting today is unfinished work. It's a working document. It's something that I have worked on for some time, but would love your feedback. And I hope that we can use this discussion time at the end to critique it, to question it, to think about other approaches. So please do challenge me. So some of you know me from Cambridge and others of you know me from LA, but my research agenda really began at the Berkeley Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies before its renaming. And when I was, as an undergrad, I had the opportunity to learn about Israel and satisfaction with democracy beyond my Jewish state school education. I was able to learn about Israel and its intricate fabric of society, learn about Palestinians, learn about the effect of the lack of constitution on Israeli society as a whole. And this issue of comparative constitutional work really led to my work that I was doing at Spotify, where I worked on hate content moderation issues, and specifically the case of Alex Jones being on the platform. And when I was there, I loved the work that I was doing there, but I left in search of additional comparative constitutional research, and I landed in Jerusalem. And I learned about Israel and the strong attempt at democracy there through the work from three perspectives, I guess. The first perspective you can see in the top picture in the third column from the left, where I sat in front of different mayoral candidates, Moshe Leon being on the far right, and then right next to him, Adi Berkowitz. And they were like the religious versus the more secular candidates. And I experienced alongside the young people of Jerusalem, what that looks like in terms of a mayoral election. Another perspective where I learned about democracy and creators was at Hanson House. Hanson House was the home of the Bezalel Academy Masters of Industrial Design program, where I also used the offices there to interview creators about their work and did general interviews. And then also I spent a lot of my time at the gallery at Hanson House called Mamuta, which we can talk about in the discussion section, which I ultimately wrote a case study about their exhibition on censorship and how in fact it was indeed censored. And then finally, I spent a lot of my time at Hebrew University, culling the data, amalgamating it all together, and thinking about what these cases looked like, which we'll dive deeper into a little bit. Then upon arrival at Cambridge, which is the lovely building, you can see King's College for those of you who have been there on the far right. And there I took the data 2 steps further. I built on the interviews that I did in Israel, and I composed and fielded a survey in 4 different other countries, which we'll talk about in a moment. But today's focus is really going to be on Israel. And I also compared that with data that I'm working through the Human Surveys Project, which is a part of the Center for the Future of Democracy. So today is not just a discussion of my research, it's also a discussion in the broader context in terms of methods of how do different types of data inform one another? How do ethnographies and being in an artist studio, how can you compare that method to a larger scope public opinion survey? And how do those data sources communicate with one another? I also want to conclude that I really just took you through a journey of over the past really 5-6 years. And I feel really humbled to be able to present in a place that feels so close to home, even though we're remotely over Zoom. So I want to start out with with that said, I want to start out with my general thesis and hypothesis. And what I really found is that the evaluation of freedom of expression is more effectively understood here through the murals of Machane Yehuda by Solomon Souza, and in the Barber Gallery in the Nachla neighborhood of Jerusalem, and by Israeli artists wrestling with what the land of Israel could potentially look like, all the way from mandatory Palestine all until today. And it's better understood in those places, in artist creator spaces, rather than here on the Capitol, in Chatham House, in the UK. I think this was a picture. I looked up the AEI offices in DC and down here at Oxford University, that perhaps creators have a more keen understanding of what democracy looks like and what freedom of expression looks like than the people that we hold up in our ivory tower in Whitehall on the Capitol. And I think that it's also important for me to describe to you a little bit about who is a creator. And in my definition, which I used, it's a visual artist, a podcaster, a filmmaker, or performance artist. I didn't interview any of the people that you can see before you on your screen, but I think that these are the kinds of people that I did interview in these different country contexts. And I had the opportunity to interview very high profile creators on an anonymous basis. And their anonymity came from many different reasons, which I'll address later, which has to do with trust and other sorts of issues related to confidentiality. So I think one other important caveat to talk about here is who funds the arts, and how it's really different in the US versus other countries in the world. In the US, we have a taxation system which enables private institutions to fund art with the benefit of a tax credit. Whereas in Israel or in England, I see you, Katie, here from the Department of Digital Culture, Media, and Sport. They fund the majority of arts. There aren't large, there are large art institutions in Europe and in Israel, but they're not nearly as large as those seen as privately funded in the United States. So my research question here is, if creator opinions are included in democracy indices freedom of expression metric, how would the indices change? How would creators affect the rankings of democracies? And here are my preliminary findings. My findings are as follows. Democracy indices are flawed, and they should include freedom of expression metrics. There are democracy indices out there that don't include them. Also, creators have a unique story that should be included in democracy indices. And Israel's and other countries' freedom of expression metrics should be revisited. And I'm going to even say that I think that the democracies that we talk about today should be ranked even lower after including creators' perspectives on freedom of expression. So now I'm going to go through 3 different key questions related to the issues at hand here. And the 3 questions that we're going to be talking about are, why should we study democracy indices? Why are they important? Second, why should we study democracy indices freedom of expression metric? And lastly, why are creator perspectives important within that context? And I have different numbers of answers to these questions, which will provide context to this discussion. So if you'll bear with me for the next 10 minutes, I'm going to go through these different questions and answers. So why should we address democracy indices? And the first answer is that democracy indices are powerful because they have multiple roles in the policymaking agora. Rankings and ratings organizations are a topic. What is a rankings and ratings organization? A ranking and ratings organization is an organization like Freedom House, like Polity, like VDEM, and they rank how democracies look on the spectrum. And Cooley and Snyder, who are 2 professors, they say that democracy indices and the ranking and ratings organizations that create them serve as judges, global regulators, and sources of governmentality and advocates. Another answer to the question for why should we address democracy indices is because they're prone to descriptive accuracy and manipulation. So Campbell's law, which I'll read for you, says, the more any quantitative social indicator is used for social decision-making, the more subject it will be to corruption pressures. And because, as we'll see in the next answer, that they're used so widely and they're really prolific, it's important that we look at them and address them because they're so prone to manipulation. Also, as we learned at Cambridge together with my cohort, that we don't just find evidence and bring that to create policy, but we have policies that we're going to use to create evidence and create evidence to support those policies. Also, democracy indices construction is problematic. And it's problematic because for a few different reasons. So it's prone to instrumentalization through their methods. And the reason why is because these indices are created essentially, like, for example, the Economist Intelligence Unit is an example of a ratings and ranking and ratings organization. And that ranking and ratings organization has their own democracy index. And the one component of that is an expert survey. So they send out a survey to experts who subscribe to the Economist politics, and they fill out a survey, and that survey is funneled into the democracy index. And people who like the Economist and like the work they're doing will fill out their survey, and those who don't will ignore it. And that already shows like key bias that's brought into the fold for democracy indices. The fourth reason why we should address them is because they're powerful. They change hearts and minds, and they influence policymakers and decision makers across the political and ideological spectrum. I think there was a study that was brought up that talked about how lots of Middle Eastern and Central Asian countries use indices in order to make key decisions. And that's how they budget, using the budgeting process in Uzbekistan. And I think that that was really interesting how powerful they are despite their subjectivity. So the second key question, so we talked about why we address democracy indices. And the second key question is, why should we study democracy indices freedom of expression metrics? And the first reason why is that freedom of expression is historically known to be a necessary condition of democracy. This is discussed historically by Plato, by John Locke, by Stanley Fish, by John Stuart Mill. It's also discussed in the present. So when I was a Fulbrighter, I participated in a conference as a part of the Israel Democracy Institute called Democracy Under Stress, where all that was talked about for 2 days was freedom of expression and the relationship between democracy and freedom of expression. The Council on Europe in 2018, their national conference was all about freedom of expression and if it's still a precondition for democracy. And then also in 2018, the United Nations dedicated its special report on the situation of freedom of expression in Mexico, which is one of the calls for why I decided to study Mexico as well as a comparative case, which we're not going to talk about as much today, but it is something else that I've looked at in the course of my research. The second answer to why to study democracy indices freedom of expression metrics is that the foremost democracy indices have civil liberties metrics address freedom of expression or creation. So Freedom House, Polity, VDEM, and EIU, the Economist Intelligence Unit, all have freedom of expression or civil liberties metrics. And why, so question number 3. So we talked about why address democracy indices. We've talked about why study democracy indices freedom of expression metric. And lastly, our last question, setting up the context for this research, is why are creator perspectives important for measuring freedom of expression? Why do creators matter? And the answer to that is the relationship between creators and democracy has been studied across time, really since the beginning of civilization and the beginning of time in history. It's been addressed by Plato, by Kant in his Third Critique, by Rousseau, by Schiller, by so many people talk about the necessity of artists within society and how looking to them is a clear indication of whether freedom of expression exists within the society. It's also important because creators can transcend politics limits. And I think that we have thought about today a lot about how creators can talk about things and talk about issues that aren't always politically correct. They can go beyond law and stir up things within society. And I'll talk about, and I'm sure that many of you are thinking about different sorts of examples, and I'll get to them in just a moment. But to contextualize this within the academic literature, Doris Sommer at Harvard wrote the book Cultural Agency in the Americas, where she talks a lot about how artists are the people who can provide some wiggle room, how they can get at the punctuated equilibrium, the time where change can occur within society, and they can cause norms to change. And I think the third answer for why creator perspectives are important for measuring freedom of expression is that, as I was alluding to before, they're a part of the current political zeitgeist. Back in 2018, when I was at Spotify, we really were thinking about how the US and the UK think about the First Amendment differently, and how the US thinks about limitations on freedom of speech, where the UK puts at the forefront of restricting speech in general and how that's more accepted. So bringing this to Israel, the big change in Israeli regulation recently was the nation state law and how that affects democracy. And that's been a common reoccurring motif throughout time. And I think that that was not more evident than this summer, where artist Itai Zaliat was arrested for trying to protect this sculpture. And this sculpture, for all of you who don't have some context, there was a famous picture that was taken of a protester being hosed down by Israeli police protesting Benjamin Netanyahu, and Itai, who was protecting the sculpture, was arrested. He also is known for this Bibi Netanyahu's Last Supper, was also a piece that was really exciting for many people to see and view. And these are just like some examples of censorship. So really looking at how the nation state law has prevented Israeli artists, specifically political art, from continuing on. And also it's been recent in the United States and really all over the world. This picture here, as some of you may have known, I'm in New York City right now, and it's protecting, these are gates protecting a statue of Christopher Columbus. A statue is another form of art in Central Park in New York City. And I think there's a lot of art also related to the Black Lives Matter movement, as well as another example I looked at was the Tigres del Norte were fined over narco corridos, which was the second major case study I looked at, was in Mexico. But again, today we're just focusing on Israel. And so when I was in Israel, I'm just going to look through the Israel lens for today. And I used three different methods. The first method was in-depth interviews and ethnography. So going into artists, and I encourage you, we're going to go on a little walk together through the streets of Jerusalem, the streets of Amman. And I found again that freedom of expression is best understood by artists, and through these experiences in artists' homes and galleries and studios covered in limestone, than perhaps that we may think in government buildings. And the way that I figure that out is not only interviewing the creator themselves. So let's say there's a creator who's creating a podcast, but also their supporters. So who's funding them? And I think a key issue here that I thought was really interesting is that for a lot of Palestinians, they were supported by non-government organizations that weren't Israeli. So for example, there are lots of organizations and institutions that come to Israel to specifically fill the gap and fund these Palestinian artists who feel like they can't express themselves due to the nation state law and the restrictions that puts on governmental funding in Israel. I think that also this doesn't just affect Palestinians, this also affects Ethiopians, it also affects other kinds of individuals within Israel. And then for a lot of these creators, there are legal cases involved. So I tried to understand who the creator was, who they're funded by, as well as the other stakeholders for their work. And I also found I tried to I interviewed about 50 individuals and their team being their lawyers, their supporters, their curators for a current or past exhibition at a museum. And that was all situated within the demographics within the state of Israel. So for example, for every 8 Jews I interviewed 2 non-Jews, some Christians, some Muslims, and I actually interviewed a few Druze individuals as well. One other method here was so after I completed these interviews, I wanted to better understand more mechanically how creators felt about democracy. And to do so, I fielded a survey. and I surveyed 750 organizations in 5 countries in a month. And how did I do that? How did I collect all of these different organizations? I use something very sophisticated here, which is called the Google Maps method. Because none of us anticipated coronavirus, I was supposed to go and travel and interview people in Mexico and Russia, thanks to Cambridge. But however, due to the pandemic, I wasn't able to travel there, and instead used Google Maps to find and identify. Here's an example for Mexico, we can see here. So I would use key search terms. So for example, art studio, Mexico City, and I did that for every state in Mexico, and then brought all of that together. And I repeated this same method for other countries as well, and also within Israel. So Jerusalem art studio, Jerusalem podcast studio, and then I would collect the addresses and then find the email addresses of those organizations and email them the survey and ask them to pass it on anonymously to their communities. I received about 300 responses in a month. I don't really have a metric or benchmark for if that's good, but I thought that because of the COVID pandemic, I thought that it was pretty good response rate, though I don't know how many people were actually surveyed. And the key question, which I asked them, was a conversion of the Net Promoter Score. Some of you who are more business-minded might know the Net Promoter Score from an app that you use on your phone. And there's been a lot of academic literature and support for using this in assessing democracy, assessing vague ideas. So that was also another part of this experimentation. So both in the fielding and sampling, as well as in this question itself, which is drawn from the business world and taken and implemented into the world, I guess, of political science. So we asked, which has also been asked in many public opinion polls from Latin Barometer, America's Barometer, Eurobarometer, how satisfied or dissatisfied, it's the classic Likert scale question of how satisfied or dissatisfied are you with democracy in your country? And that leads to my third big method, which is big data. And you'll see in just a few moments how the data compares. So we had the compares between the Wenger survey, which is my fielded survey, and the data collected through YouGov and the Human Surveys Project. So thanks to Dr. Roberto Foa from Cambridge, who was so willing to share some YouGov data with me, I was able to compare my survey with general surveys from the past of how lay people feel about democracy. So now I'm going to share my data with you, my basic findings. And let me describe to you really briefly what we see here. So we have the country, United States, United Kingdom, Mexico, and Israel. The survey, what percentage of people were fairly satisfied with democracy in their country. And then an alternative survey. The alternative survey means that it came from one of these surveys, as we can see down here, or like Latino Barometer or YouGov, versus which have ends of thousands of people, whereas my survey had them in the tens of people. And then I also asked, how satisfied, so I asked, how satisfied or dissatisfied are you with democracy in the US? And then I asked qualitatively why. And I thought one really interesting finding is that discrimination, the number one reason is lack of funding, which isn't surprising. But what I thought was surprising is that discrimination against minorities came up in all 4 countries as like the second or third choice. And minorities was described in a really different way. In Mexico, it was described as indigenous people, whereas in Israel, it was described as non-Jews or Ethiopian Jews, or even a couple of respondents said Haredi Jews, the ultra Orthodox, were discriminated against. I think, so we talked a lot about different sources of data here. We talked about the ethnographies and interviews in art studios. We've talked about the survey that I fielded in this large, strange Google Maps method. We've talked about the large big data, public opinion polls comparing creators to lay people, and ultimately finding that lay people are far more satisfied with democracy than creators in most countries, especially in Israel. And then the last source of data here we have are, I guess, the results sort of from these case studies. And the one case study I'd like to talk to you about today in the next 2 minutes is the Barbour Gallery. The Barbour Gallery was especially poignant to me because I lived right next door. I spent 9 months living right next door to the Barbour Gallery in Nachlaot. For those of you who've been to Jerusalem and live in Jerusalem, the Barbour Gallery is the life and breath. It was an old, I think 18 years now, it was converted from an old community garden shelter into an art exhibition by students at Betzalel. And since then, it's hosted a wide slew of emerging artists. It also has been open and used as a space by Shovrim Shtika, or Breaking the Silence, a place for soldiers who didn't approve or feel like their actions within the Israeli military were appropriate to come and tell their stories and talk about their experiences there. So I think in the early teens, the Jerusalem municipality, which was funding the Barbour and giving the Barbour this space, said, and when they started having these Shovrim Shtika, the Breaking the Silence meetings, said to the people at the gallery, sorry, we're not going to allow you to have this space anymore, which for some people in the community that I interviewed was totally legitimate. It's a city municipality owned space. The municipality can allocate it as it pleases. But for others in the community, especially creators, they saw it as an assault or a challenge to their freedom of expression, that they no longer could create art in a shared space and exhibit their art in a space that is shared by things that are against the state, or not, as Miri Regev would say, loyal. Miri Regev being the Minister of Culture as a part of the Likud party, Benjamin Netanyahu's party. So with all that said, I'm happy to dive into the case study a little bit more later, but it's been an ongoing case, and I think the most recent update, please correct me if I'm wrong, to all of those Israelis in the room, but so far I think that there's been a ceasefire. They're allowed to stay there for a certain extra amount of time until it is challenged again. So what are my findings? In the US, the UK, Russia, Mexico, and Israel, when comparing national public opinion data to the July 2020 survey, creators are less satisfied with democracy than the average person. This could have many sort of confounding factors, like the pandemic, and also these public opinion surveys. We didn't have the findings of the larger public opinion surveys at the time of the pandemic to compare directly apples to apples, but we did the best measurement that we could. Again, these are experimental new methods, and perhaps the numbers would be slightly more aligned there. Again, this is the slide I showed you at the beginning. These are 3 key findings. The first being that democracy indices are flawed and should include freedom of expression metrics in general. Also, creators have a unique story that should be included in democracy indices. And Israel and other countries' freedom of expression metrics should be revisited. There are clear limitations. So sampling and fielding. The Google Maps method has not yet been sanctioned. I haven't heard about it in my time, but it was my adjustment that I had to make due to COVID. There are also confounding factors related to COVID. And then lastly, I think that, So in terms of areas for future research, there should be the use of the Net Promoter Score in evaluating democracy. Like, does it really work? What is the effect of the pandemic on satisfaction with democracy? And then lastly, this entire research project was in response to Cooley and Snyder's book, which I talked a little bit about before, about them saying that there should be more original research to challenge democracy indices. And this, I think, is a response to that creators could be the added perspective to refine and perhaps fix or amend democracy indices overall. So with that, let's talk, let's discuss. Thank you so much for listening to me and for being here. And please, let's talk together. Thank you.
Thank you so much for presenting today and sharing your insights from all of this accumulated research. Please join me in thanking Daniela for a really great talk.
And thank you to you for having me, and thank you everyone for coming. It really means so much to me that you took time out of your day to come listen to me talk again about careers in democracy.
We look toward the next stage. Thank you.
Thanks.